Hello, boos and ghouls. This is Terry of Terry and Al Spirits talking, and you're watching Jessie's Paranormal Adventures channel.
Hello everyone. If you will, please go like and subscribe to Jessie's Paranormal Adventures, please. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my ghost story. It's not long, it's short, but it's something that happened to me when I was 5 years old to 8 years old. When I was 5 years old, it was about my mother. She was sick and had ovarian cancer. And, we were just at home one night when we was at the hospital. Came home and it was getting late, and I noticed something over me, and I looked up. This is when I was 5 years old, and I remember it like it was yesterday, and it's true. And I looked up and I seen my mama, and I knew it was her because I remember looking up at her and saying "Mama." And I was trying to, get to her, and she just stood there, looked at me and smiled. And a little bit after, not very long, I noticed something she was reaching down, and she kissed me on my cheek, and I could feel a spark on me. And it wasn't long. I looked up and she had disappeared. Her apparition left. Where she left, she was waving at me like this, and I was waving at her, and then that's when her apparition left, and she descended away. And of course I cried because I miss my mama, And then there was when I was 8 years old, I came to this thing, because I always, I slept in my own room by myself, and I was living with my grandparents. And I don't know, I had weird things happened to me. But when I was 8, I noticed I went to sleep, and I woke up. I looked down at the end of my feet. There was 2 heads floating down the end of my bed. It was very scary. I was scared to death. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I was scared. And my grandparents all didn't like me going in their room because, they wanted me to sleep in my own room. So I was so scared, but I laid there thinking it would go away, and it didn't. I woke back up thinking I shut my eyes and woke back up and looked down. They were still down there floating down into my bed. So I didn't know what, and then a little bit after that I just was so scared. I just laid there, went back to sleep, and then when I woke up it was the next morning, which I was very scared. I didn't know why I was having that, or why they were there. So I don't know. It was just really scary to me. But anyway, that's my story, and I know it's not long, it's short. But please do go like and subscribe to Jessie's Paranormal Adventure, please. She's a good person and has really good videos. And thank y'all. Bye. God bless. Bye.
When he came to the third dead end, Charlie had to admit he was lost. Rebecca was asleep in the passenger seat, wrapped in a thick woolen blanket, her head resting on his folded-up jacket. Charlie watched her sleep for just a minute, the car warm bubble in the snow-covered countryside. "Beck," he called softly. She roused and looked at him sleepily. "We're here?" He smiled guiltily. "Actually, we're lost." She straightened and looked at the large hedge blocking her way. "This doesn't look like my parents' house," she said dryly. Her blue eyes sparkled as she brushed an errant strand of blonde hair out of her eyes. She looked down at her GPS screen, which the dealer had said was state-of-the-art and infallible. It was dark. That damn thing flickered and went out about 20 minutes ago, Charlie said. I was trying to do the route from memory, and he gestured lamely at the large hedge. They both fiddled with the GPS, which refused to respond. They both brought out cell phones, which politely informed them that they were in the land of no service. Rebecca looked at him, and Charlie shrugged and grinned, his slightly lopsided grin. His unruly brown hair and that smile always made her think of some character out of Mark Twain's story. It had started to get stuffy in the car, and she cracked the window to let in some fresh air. It was clean and crisp, and put her in mind of childhood Christmases, filled with snow, not the hot or rainy ones in California. Charlie was about to put the vehicle in reverse when Rebecca cocked her head. She turned down the CD player, which had been playing Nat King Cole's version of It's a Christmas Song. Do you hear that? She asked, her eyes closing as she concentrated. Now he listened and heard it as well. Music? A waltz? Rebecca got her hat and gloves from the glove box. Charlie looked at her. They must have a phone we can use to call my parents. At the very least, they will have better directions then. She tapped the GPS screen, which still ignored them. Charlie grinned, then the car shuddered and was still. He tried turning the key and there was nothing, not even a click from the starter. He looked at Rebecca and she shrugged. Rebecca got out of the car and he followed her, grabbing his own woolen hat and muffler from the back seat. Rebecca was already edging around the tall hedge, and he had visions of someone taking a shot at her or a vicious dog charging her. And on Christmas? Steady, old boy, he told himself. You're not in Los Angeles or even New York. Lately, his inner voice had started to sound like some stuffy Englishman, a character actor from those old movies, maybe. He hadn't told Rebecca. It was a little embarrassing. They'd been invited to spend Christmas with Rebecca's family in Virginia, some sleepy little burg called Denton's Mill. It was supposed to be very picturesque and lovely, and Rebecca had been very excited. Charlie was happy to see her happy, but wasn't sure about spending the entire Christmas holiday with her folks. He was the one that suggested they make a road trip out of it, take a week for travel back and forth to Virginia with a couple stops at romantic B&Bs. That way, he figured, they'd be guaranteed a good time, even if her father still treated him like the upstart had stolen his daughter. And indeed, they had been having a great time, so what if the GPS crapped out? And so what if the car wouldn't start? They called AAA, give directions, and soon they'd be getting one of Glenn's 2 strong handshakes and Scott shoved in his hand. Merry Christmas! He rounded the hedge where Rebecca stood and stared. Before them stood a grand house of brick, 2 stories with a large ornate cupola, flanked by 2 great chimneys. Charlie figured the house must be well over 100 years old, but it looked new. The place was ablaze with lanterns and candlelight, and they could see a great Christmas tree in the downstairs window. There was a tang of wood smoke in the air, something that always reminded Charlie of summers with his family. The nostalgia the smoke brought forth was almost painful. I think I smell turkey, Rebecca said, and pumpkin pie. They hurried on, shoes crunching in the snow, their breaths steaming in white puffs. There was no doorbell, so Charlie used a large brass knocker set in lion's mouth. The door opened, and a man dressed in colonial garb answered the door. He was tall and dour, and his face showed no hint of welcome. Yes? Charlie was about to tell him about the car and the fried electrical system when an enormously fat man in a powdered wig and luxurious clothes hurried to the door. Happy Christmas, my friends. Come in, come in. Charlie and Rebecca went in, glad to be out of the cold. From the looks of things, it was quite a party. A costume party, Charlie amended, because everyone was dressed as elaborately as their host. Charlie was no expert on fashion or history, but they all looked as if they had spent the afternoon signing the Declaration of Independence. The air was thick with the smells of wine and pipe smoke, burning pine logs somewhere, a turkey nearly ready. Charlie's mouth began to water, and he hoped he wouldn't drool. Have you eaten? You must be starved. Jenkins, take their coats. Give them some mulled wine. Rebecca touched the arm of the large man as he turned, smiling at her with holiday cheer. His face was flushed and his nose was bright red, and Charlie realized he was probably drunk. We need to reach my father in Denton's Mill. I know the place, my dear, but no one's going there tonight. He gestured at the window with his head, and she and Charlie looked. A snowstorm had begun. Even as they looked, they could hear the wind roaring outside, and there was no visibility beyond a few feet. "You'd freeze in your carriage," he went on. "Why not celebrate Christmas Eve with us, and tomorrow we shall see you safely to Denton's Mill. That is, if that's where you really want to go." He winked at her, and she laughed, and he laughed and looked at Charlie, who also laughed. Their host, whose name was James Chesterton, had Jenkins show them to a room upstairs where dry clothes were waiting for them. Costumes, actually, with hose and breeches included for him, an array of petticoats for her. Neither of them was quite certain what everything was for, but a valet and a handmaid were also present to help them dress. Charlie demurred when offered a wig, saying he was not a landowner and didn't wish to give the wrong impression. He wondered what had inspired him to say that, but he decided he must have recalled it from some show on the History Channel. Both Charlie and Rebecca tried reaching her parents on their cells, but neither had any power. When they asked the servants about using a telephone, they received apologies or blank looks. When they were at last ready to go downstairs, they looked at one another and laughed. Rebecca was dressed in silk of a midnight blue with crisp white petticoats, while Charlie was in silk of pearlescent gray with a vest of silver and black. "You look like Scarlett O'Hara," he told her. "I think you're about 100 years off, sweetie." Charlie took her in his arms and kissed her. "Well, you look beautiful. You look very handsome, good sir." They grinned, and then she looked at him. "Think he means to murder us? He could have done that by leaving us outside. The absence of phones bothers me. Probably pack they all make, no modern devices during the party." In addition to the turkey, they could now smell roast beef and ham. Both realized they were famished. Charlie offered Rebecca's arm. She took it, and they went downstairs. It was a splendid party, though Charlie had to remind himself constantly not to talk about anything anachronistic, which pretty much summed up his home life. He worked as a CPA and his very existence as a male of the new millennium. One time he happened to mention the History Channel. The woman he was talking to asked him if that was on cable. When he asked her to repeat it herself, she looked stricken and said she wasn't sure what this History Channel was he was referring to. Was it a waterway in the colonies? Dinner was sumptuous and festive, with strange but delightful taste and aromas. Charlie was seated across from Rebecca and couldn't get over how lovely she looked, or how well she seemed to fit in here. After dinner, many of them gathered around the great fireplace in the main room. The fire popped and sizzled. The flames sent shadows dancing across the walls and ceiling. Their host stood before them. "My friends," he said, his bright eyes twinkling in the firelight, "I thank you for warming my home with your sweet and generous spirits. Now is the time for telling of tales, for those newest among us who regale us with a tale of ghost or some other manner of beast or sprite." He waggled a pudgy finger at them, "and spin a lively yarn, for the best tale will receive the most excellent gift." James Chesterton pointed at a man standing near the back. "You, sir." The man stepped forward, cleared his throat, and the tales began. Late one March night in the English county of Lancashire, a man of average height and middle years left a tavern called the White Bull and headed down a narrow lane for home. His name was Gabriel Fisher, and with him was his dog Trotty. Fisher was, perhaps, a little merrier than he had been during the day, but that night's journey was to sober him quickly. A sickle moon cast its thin light down on tree and hedgerow. The evening was chilly, and Fisher walked along briskly enough, hearing a little else but his own footfalls. As the man and his dog reached the midway point of their homeward journey, however, the silence was shattered by a high-pitched scream. The dog began to whine. Fisher automatically ordered it to silence, and the sound of his own voice helped restore his courage. He peered into the gloom. On the road ahead was a figure, roughly human in form, though at a distance, and in that light it was hard to say. Firmly gripping his walking staff, Fisher approached. The figure was a woman. She must have emanated the scream herself. But why was a woman abroad at this hour on this little traveled road? Even as he pondered this, his dog turned tail and fled. Fisher shouted after it, shrugged, then hurried to catch up with the woman, who had begun walking in the direction he himself was taking. She spoke not a word, and her bowed head was concealed by a large bonnet. Fisher drew up beside her and began to question her, but to his solicitous inquiries she made only the faintest replies. Yet her voice was somehow soothing, teasing even, with a hint of lovely melody. He adjusted his long step to her shorter one and paced beside her down the road. She carried a large cloth-covered market basket, and after a moment Fisher asked if he might carry it for her. She handed the basket to him, and he happily settled the wicker handle on his arm. The woman's gentle voice said, "You're much too kind." Then it broke into an unpleasantly mocking, tinkling laugh. Fisher looked in some surprise toward his companion, but she was turned away from him, apparently examining the hedge that bordered the road. The laugh sounded again more loudly. It came from the basket. Fisher stopped in his tracks and with a horrified oath flung the basket away. As he stared, it hit the ground. Its cover fell away, and a head, wider than the cloth that had concealed it, bounced out onto the road. Teeth shone in its wide-stretched form, which issued a stream of cackling giggles. Fisher whirled to face his companion, who had turned toward him. Her bonnet had fallen back, her shoulders shook with soundless laughter, and she had no head. Fisher leaped over the basket, took off down the road, running as he had not run since boyhood. Over the pounding of his heart, he heard scuffling and then quick footsteps behind him. He ran on, his breath coming in loud sobs, and as he ran, he looked back, only to see the arm of the woman raised high, lifting the head like a lantern. The head laughed again, and she threw it after him. It struck the dirt of its own accord, sprang back into the air, whisking past Fisher, its eyes glittering and its teeth cackling. When it again landed in the road, Fisher made an attempt to jump over it, but the head jumped too, snapping at his ankles. Once more the head passed him, then cut in front of his path and forced a second leap from Fisher, one that took his feet just clear of the vicious, biting grin. Fully caught up in its macabre sport now, the head played about his feet, snapping and laughing maniacally. Fisher sped on, too terrified to tire or even to look back, although he realized that the woman and her head were close behind him. When he came to a shallow stream that ran across the road, he charged through it in an explosion of spray, then continued up a rise in the road. As he crested the hill, Fisher cast a quick glance over his shoulder, and the sight he saw in that one instant was impressed on his mind for the rest of his days. Below him, on the far side of the stream, stood a woman's figure, tall and stolid and headless still. Around its feet cavorted the head, snapping and snarling like some outlandish terrier. The hair of the head was caked with mud and the face blotched with dust. Yet the head's baleful energy seemed to have reached a new pitch. Fisher could see its eyes blazing with malignity and hear a hellish echo in its cackling laughter. Sick with loathing, he ran on, but he ran alone. The ghost, apparently limited in territory like others of its kind, could not cross running water. Gabriel Fisher's adventure ended safely, even a little comically. He arrived home to find an irritable wife soothing the still trembling Trotty. Her response to his stammered explanation was a barbed witticism. She said she was glad he had learned the wisdom of coming home early, even though it had taken a headless woman to teach him. She head and all, had never been able to make that point. Others too scoffed when Gabriel recited his tale. But he was not the last person beset by the ghoul on that lonely stretch of road. Why the woman and her head patrolled there in the darkness no one ever knew, nor did they know precisely when the haunting ceased, for the people of Lincolnshire gave up all use of that narrow lane by night, and the children would not even venture there, even in the daylight. Amid the forested mountains of northern Sweden in centuries past, the long winter nights were crowded with the restless, greeting dead. The living, isolated for months in villages hidden among the fir trees, stayed indoors for the most part. They knew the darkness did not belong to them. They knew that things could happen outside the safe circle of the hearth that were best not risked or even thought of. This was especially true in the bleak time around the winter solstice, as a Christmas tale relates. In her cottage on a hillside, a woman was awakened early one Christmas morning by church bells echoing in the air. When the peal ceased, she peered out the window. It was dark as it would be until almost noon at that time of year. But far below, she saw that the doors of the village church were thrown open, and its light was streaming out in welcome. Although she could not be sure of the hour, it was clear that Christmas service was about to begin. In some haste, the woman dressed, wrapped herself in her warmer shawl, and taking a lantern to light her way, set out down the hill for the church. None of her neighbors were in view, and nothing broke the enveloping silence except the occasional crackle of ice falling from tree branches and the crunching of the snow underfoot. As she neared the little church, however, she heard snatches of singing borne in the air, and she walked faster, spurred by the thought of warmth and companionship. At the open church door, she set down her lantern and composed her thoughts to suit the joyful day. Within the nave were rows of hooded heads. Her neighbors had been more alert than she, it seemed. Intoning psalms at the head of the congregation was a priest robed not in the pristine white of this great festival, but in indeterminate gray. He looked up at the woman peering into the church and bent once more to the prayers, so that his face was hidden. She crept up the aisle between the rows of chanting worshippers, searching for a place to sit. Then help came. A gentle hand grasped her wrist, and a soft voice spoke into her ear. "This way, dear one." Her rescuer guided her to the front of the church. The singers seated there shuffled sideways on their bench to make room, but such was their intentness on the hymn that not one looked up or greeted her. She sat down meekly, and her guide sat beside her. Having settled herself in the pew, the woman turned to thank her helper, but the words died on her lips. The person sitting beside her had thrown back her concealing hood. The woman recognized the face at once, although it was much changed. It was the face of her beloved sister, whom she herself had laid in her coffin that autumn, before the first snowfall. The sister laid a bony hand upon the woman's arm, the damaged face twisted in expression that might have been pleading. It was hard to tell, for the head was little more than gleaming bone, still adorned with pasty shreds of flesh. The lipless mouth stretched open to speak. A gust of odor, a sweet, necrotic scent, tinged the smell of earth, swept across the living visitor. No sound came from the mouth, but all around the woman eddied the most toneless chanting of the clustered congregation. She pulled her arm free from the bony clasp and began to inch across the bench. The figure gestured, and the woman found her voice. "You're all dead," she cried shoutily. At At once, as if a spell had been broken, the singing stopped, and a profound and listening silence settled upon the congregation. Heads turned toward her, hoods fell back. Shufflings and rustlings began in whispers without words. The woman felt a hand on her shoulder and jerked around. Behind her was a gleaming skeleton, and beside it another. All up and down the shadowy rows swayed the figures of the dead. Some still partially clothed in flesh she had recognized. They were people from the village, or had been not long ago. Here, shoulder blade protruded from the rags of a dress. There, wisp of hair clung to whitened skull. Some of the figures were no more than bone, and these she could not recognize. Some, no doubt, dead lost, had faded into almost transparent shadows. The congregation began to move, drifting in blind and stumbling sort of way toward the living being among them. Hands cupped to ears or outstretched, feeling the air. Her sister's voice sounded again close by. They have heard you. Run before they find you, for they have you with them if they can. They hunger for fresh company. And the woman rose, trembling to her feet. She was as quiet as she could be, but each skull turned at once in her direction, and bony fingers pointed. She edged off the bench and stepped into the aisle, the ragged figures clutching at one another, twittering and clicking their teeth, stretching their faces, and gleaming grins began to close in. Stepping as lightly as she could, she hurried down the aisle, but they swarmed behind her, unerring, following the sounds of her footsteps. She ran, smelling the earth smell and the stench of death, and at her back she felt sharp prodding. A hand grasped her shoulder. She shook it off. Fingers clutched at her shawl as she gained the door, and she slipped from the fabric and leapt out in the cold night air. Behind her, a single howl issued from the church, and that was all. Gibbering with fear, she made for her priest's house to find him just awake and preparing for Christmas Mass. After she told her tale, the priest himself, holding his crucifix high before him, led her back to the church. The church was empty and peaceful. The shawl, or what little was left of it, lay near the door. It was torn and clawed, almost beyond recognition. A conspicuous object attracted my attention some mile or more towards the opening in the land. It was a vessel lying high up on the mud, looking as if she was abandoned. The ducks had pitched 100 yards or so beyond the island, and I approached as cautiously as I could. But just as I was putting down the stake to take up my gun, there was a swift sound of beating wings and splashing water, and away my birds flew low over the mud towards the old hulk. Here was my chance, I thought. If I could get on board and remain hidden, I might be patiently waiting to get a shot. I looked at my watch. There was still plenty of daylight left, and the tide was only just beginning to leave the mud. I punted away, therefore, with renewed hope, and was not long in getting up to the old ship. There was just sufficient water over the mud to allow me to approach within 10 or 12 feet, but further I could not push the punt. This was disappointing, however. I noticed a deep lake ran on the other side and determined to try my luck there. So with a slosh and a heave, I got the flat afloat again, made for the deeper water. It turned out quite successful, and I was enabled to get right under the square overhanging counter, while a little lane of water led alongside her starboard quarter. I pushed the nose of the punt into this, and was not long in clambering on board by the rusty irons of her forechains. The old vessel lay nearly upright on the soft mud, and a glance told she would never be used again. Her gear and rigging were there, all rotten. Everything valuable had been removed. She was a brig of some 200 tons and had been a fine vessel, no doubt. To me, there is always a world of romance in a deserted ship. The places she has been to, the scenes she has witnessed, the possibility of crime, of adventure. All these thoughts crowd upon me when I see an old hulk lying deserted and forgotten, left to rot upon the mud of some lonely creek. In order to keep my punt afloat as long as possible, I towed her round and moored her under the stern, and then looked over the bulwarks for the duck. There they were, swimming not more than 150 yards away, and they were coming towards me. I remained perfectly concealed under the high bulwark, and I could see them paddling and feeding in the greasy weed. Their approach was slow, but I could afford to wait. Nearer and nearer they came. Another minute, and they would be well within shot. I was already congratulating myself upon the success of my adventure, and thinking of the joy of Jones at this large accession to his larder, when suddenly there was a heavy splash, and with a wild spluttering rush the whole pack rose out of the water and went skimming over the mud towards the distant sea. I left off both barrels after them and tried to console myself by thinking I saw the feathers fly from one, but not a bird dropped, and I was left alone in my chagrin. What could have caused the splash, that luckless splash, I wondered. There was surely no one else aboard the ship, and certainly no one could get out here without mud paddles or boats. I looked around. All was perfectly still. Nothing broke the monotony of the grey scene, sodden and damp and lifeless. A chill breeze came upon from the southwest, bringing with it a raw mist which was blotting out the dark distance and fast limiting my horizon. The day was drawing in. I must be thinking of going home. As I turned around, my attention was arrested by seeing a duck punt glide past me in the now rapidly falling water which was swirling by the mud bank on which the vessel lay. But there was no one in her. A dreadful thought struck me. It must be my boat, and how shall I get home? I ran to the stern and looked over. The duck punt was gone. The frayed and stranded end of the painter told me how it had happened. I had not allowed for the fall of the tide, and the strain of the punt as the water fell away had snapped the line, old and rotten as it was. I hurried to the bows, and jumping into the bitts, I saw my punt peacefully drifting away some quarter of a mile off. It was perfectly evident I could not hope to get her again. It was beginning to rain steadily. I could see that I was in for dirty weather, and became a little anxious about how I was going to get back, especially as it was now rapidly growing dark. So thick was it that I could not see the low land anywhere, and can only judge of its position by remembering that the stern of the vessel pointed that way. The conviction grew upon me that I could not possibly get away from this doleful old hulk without assistance, and how to get to it I could not for the life of me see. I had not seen a sign of a human being the whole day. It was not likely any more would be about at night. However, I shouted as loud as I could, and then I waited to hear if there were any response. There was not a sound, only the wind moaned slightly through the stumps of the mast. Something creaked in the cabin. Well, I thought at least it might be worse. I shall have shelter for the night. While I had been left on one of the islands, I should have had to spend the night exposed to the pelting rain. Happy thought. Go below before it gets too dark and see what sort of berth can be got, and if the worst comes to the worst, so thinking, I went to the booby hatch and found it, as I expected, that it was half broken open and anyone below could go in who liked to. As I stepped down the rotting companion, the air smelt foul and dank. I went below very cautiously, for I was not at all sure the boards would bear me. It was fortunate I did so, for as I stepped off the lowest step, the floor gave way under my foot, and had I not been holding on to the stair rail, I should have fallen through. Before going any further, I looked around. The prospect was not inviting. The light was dim. I could scarcely make out objects near me. All else was obscurity. I could see the whole of the inside of the vessel was completely gutted. What little light there was came through the stern ports. A small round speck of light looked at me out of the darkness ahead. I could see that the flooring had either all given way or been taken out of her. At my feet a gleam of water showed me what to expect if I should slip through the floor joist. Altogether more desolate, gloomy, ghostly place it would be difficult to find. I could not see any bunk or locker where I could sit down, and everything movable had been taken out of the hulk. Groping my way with increasing caution, I stepped across the joist and fell on the side of the cabin. I soon came to the bulkhead. Continuing to grope, I came to an opening. If the cabin was dim, here was blackness itself. I felt it would be useless to attempt to go further, especially as a very foul and damp odor came out from the bilge water in her hole. As I stood looking into the darkness, a creepy, chilling shudder passed over me, and with a shiver I turned round to look at the cabin. My eyes had now become used to the gloom. A deeper patch of darkness on my right suggested the possibility of a berth, and groping my way over to it, I found the lower bunk was still entire. Here at least I could rest if I found it impossible to get ashore. Having some wax vestas in my pocket, I struck a light to examine the bulk. It was better than I expected. If I could only find something to burn, I should be comparatively cheerful. Before reconciling myself to an uncomfortable position, I resolved to see whether I could not get to the shore, and went to the rickety stairs again. It was raining hard, and the wind had got up. Nothing could be more dismal. I looked over the side and lowered myself down from the main chains to see if they were possible to walk over the mud. I found I could not reach the mud at all, and the fearfulness of unable to climb back if I let go, I clambered up the side again and got on board. It was quite clear I must pass the night here. Before going below, I once more shouted at the top of my voice, more to keep my own spirits than with any hope of being heard, and then I paused to listen. No, not a sound of any sort replied. I now prepared to take myself as comfortable as I could. It was a dreary prospect. I would rather have spent the night on deck than below in the foul cabin, but the drenching, driving rain as well as the cold drove me to seek shelter below. It seemed so absurd to be in the position of a shipwrecked sailor, within 2 or 3 miles of a prosy country hamlet, and in the landlocked harbor, while actually on land, if the slimy deep mud could be called land. I had not any matches left, but I had my gun and cartridges. The idea had occurred to me to fire off minute guns. That's what I ought to do, of course. The red flash will be seen in this dark night, for it was dark now and no mistake. Getting up to the highest part of the vessel, I blazed away. The noises sounded to me deafening. Surely the whole countryside would be aroused. After firing off a dozen cartridges, I waited, but the silence only seemed more oppressive, and the blackness all darker. It's no good, I'll turn in, I dejectedly. With great difficulty, I groped my way to the top of the companion ladder and bumped dismally down the steps. If I had only light, I could be fairly comfortable, I thought. Happy thought. Make a spit devil, as we used when boys to call a little cone of damp gunpowder. I got out my last 2 cartridges, emptied the powder carefully into my hand. I moistened it, worked it to a paste. Then I placed it on the smooth end of the rail and lighted it. It was brilliant, at least it seemed by the contrast of the absolute blackness around me. But by its light, I was able to find my way to the bunk, and it lasted just long enough for me to arrange myself fairly comfortably for the night. By contriving a succession of matches, I was enabled to have enough light to eat my frugal supper, for I had kept a little sherry and a few sandwiches to meet emergencies, and it was a fortunate thing I had. The light and the food made me feel more cheery, and by the time the last match had gone out, I felt worse might have happened to me by a long way. As I lay still, waiting for sleep to come, the absurdity of the situation forced itself upon me. Here I was, all intents and purposes, as much cut off from communication with the rest of the world as if I were casted upon a deserted island. The chances were I should make someone see or hear me the next day. Jones would be certain to have the country searched, and at the longest I should only endure the discomfort of one night, and get well laughed at for my pains. But meanwhile I was absolutely severed from all human contact, and was isolated as Robinson Crusoe, only more so, for I had no other living thing whatever to share my solitude. The silence of the place was perfect, and if silence could woo sleep, sleep ought very soon to have come. But when one is hungry and wet in a strange, uncanny kind of place, besides being in one's clothes, it's a very difficult thing to go to sleep. First my head was too low, then after resting on my arms it got cramped. My back seemed all over bumps. When I turned on my side, I appeared to have gotten rather serious enlargement of the hip joint. I found my damp clothes smelly and musty. After sighing and groaning for some time, I set it for a change of position and nearly fractured my skull in doing so against the remains of what once had been a berth above me. I didn't dare to move in the inky blackness, for I'd seen sufficient to know I must be very easily break my leg or neck in the floorless cabin. There was nothing for it but to sit still or lie down and wait for daylight. I had no means of telling time. When I last looked at my watch before the match had gone out, it was not more than 6 o'clock. It might not be 8, and perhaps not so late. Fancy 12 long hours spent in that doleful black place with nothing in the world to do to pass the time. I suppose I went to sleep. All I can recollect after lying down is keeping my mind resolutely turned inwards, as it were, and fixed upon the arduous business of counting an imaginary and interminable flock of sheep pass one by one through an ideal gate. This meritorious method of compelling sleep had, no doubt, been rewarded, but I had no means of knowing how long I slept. I cannot tell at what hour of the night the following strange occurrences occurred, for occur they certainly did, and I am as perfectly convinced that I was the oral witness to some ghastly crime as I am that I am writing these lines. I have little doubt I shall be laughed at, as Jones laughed at me, being told that I was dreaming, but I was overtired and nervous. In fact, so accustomed I've been to this sort of thing that I now hardly ever tell my tale, or if I do, I put it in the third person, and then find people believe it, or at least take much more interest in it. I suppose the reason is that some people cannot bring themselves to think so strange a thing could have happened to such a prosy, everyday sort of man as myself, and they cannot divest their minds of the idea that I am well, to put in mildly, drawing on my imagination for facts. Perhaps if the tale appears in print it will be believed, as a fastidious friend of mine once said to a newly married couple who had just seen the announcement of their marriage in the Times. "Ah, didn't know you were married until you saw it in print." Well, by the time what I may have been, all I know is the next thing I can remember after getting my 500th sheep across the gate is that I heard two most horrible yells ring through the darkness. I sat bolt upright, and as proof that my senses were all there, I did not bring my head this time against the berth overhead, remembering to bend it outward so as to clear it. There was not another sound. The silence was as absolute as the darkness. I must have been dreaming, I thought, but the sounds were ringing in my ears, and my heart was beating with excitement. There must have been some reason for this. I never was taken this way before. I could not make it out and felt very uncomfortable. I sat there listening for some time. No other sound breaking the deathly stillness, and becoming tired of sitting, I lay down again. Once more I set myself to get my interminable flocks through the gate, but I could not help myself listening. There seemed to me a sound growing in the darkness, a something gathering in the particles of the air, as if molecules of the atmosphere were wrestling together and with steely movements were whispering something. The wind had died down, and I would have gone on deck if I could move, but it was hazardous enough moving around in the light. It would have been madness to attempt to move in the blackness, and so I lay still and tried to sleep. But now there was a sound, indistinct, but no mere fancy, a muffled sound as if some movement in the forepart of the ship. I listened intently and gazed in the darkness. What was the sound? It did not seem like rats. It was a dull shuffling kind of noise, very indistinct and conveying no clue whatever as to its cause. It lasted only for a short time, but now the cold damp air seemed to have become more piercingly chilly. The raw iciness seemed to strike into the very marrow of my bones, and my teeth chattered. At the same time a new scent seemed to be assailed, the foul odor which I had noticed arising from the stagnant water and the bilge appeared to rise into more objectionable prominence, as if it had been stirred. "I cannot stand this," I muttered, shivering in horrible aversion to the disgusting odor. "I will go on deck at all hazards." Rising to put this resolve in execution, I was arrested by the noise beginning again. I listened. This time I distinctly distinguished two separate sounds, one like a heavy soft weight being dragged along with difficulty, the other like the hard sound of boots on boards. Could there be others on board after all? If so, why they made no sound when I clambered on deck or afterwards when I shouted and fired my gun? Clearly, if there were people, they wished to remain concealed, and my presence was inconvenient to them. But how absolutely still and quiet they'd kept. It appeared incredible that there should be anyone. I listened intently. The sound had ceased again, and once more the most absolute stillness reigned around. A gentle swishing, wobbling, lapping noise seemed to form itself in the darkness. It increased until I recognized the chattering and bubbling of water. It must be the tide which is rising, I thought. It has reached the rudder and is eddying around the stern post. This also accounted in my mind for the other noises, because as tide surrounded the vessel, and she thus became waterborne, all kinds of sounds might be produced in the old hulk as she resumed her upright position. However, I could not get rid of the chilly, horrid feeling those two screams had produced, combined with the disgusting smell, which was getting more and more obtrusive. It was foul, horrible, revolting, like some carrion, putrid and noxious. I prepared to take my chances of damage and rose up to grope my way to the companion ladder. It was a more difficult job than I had an idea of. I had my gun, it was true. With it I could feel for the joist, but when I once to let go of the bunk, I had nothing to steady me and nearly went headlong at the first step. Fortunately, I went back in time to prevent my fall, but this attempt convinced me that I had better endured the strange horrors of the unknown than the certain miseries of a broken leg or neck. I sat down, therefore, on the bunk. Now that my own movements had ceased, I became aware that the shuffling noise was going on all the time. Well, thought I, they may shuffle, they won't hurt me, and I shall go to sleep again. So reflecting, I lay down, holding my gun, ready to use as a club if necessary. Now it is all very well to laugh at superstitious terrors. Nothing is easier than to obtain a cheap reputation for brilliancy, independence of thought, and courage by deriding the fears of the supernatural when comfortably seated in a drawing room well lighted with company. But put those scoffers in a like situation with mine, I don't believe they would have been any more free from a feeling of the reverse of bold, mocking, and comfortable than I was. I had read that the most powerful ghost story, The Haunted and the Haunters, by Lord Lytton, and the vividness of that weird tale had always impressed me greatly. Was I actually now to experience in my own person, and with no possibility of escape, the trying ordeal that bold ghost hunter went through under much more favorable circumstances? He at least had a servant with him. He had fuel and a light, and above all, he could get away when he wanted to. I felt I could face any number of spiritual manifestations if only I had warmth and light, but the icy coldness of the air was eating into my bones, and I shivered until my teeth chattered. I could not get to sleep. I could not prevent myself listening, and at last I gave up the contest and I let myself listen. But there seemed now nothing to listen to. All the time I've been refusing to let my ears do their office by putting my handkerchief over one ear and lying on my arm with the other. A confused noise appeared to reach me, but the moment I turned around to lay on my back, everything seemed quiet. It's only my fancy after all. The result of cold one of good dinner. I will go to sleep. But in spite of all this, I lay still, listening a little longer. There was the sound of trickling water against the broad bilge of the old hulk, and I knew the tide was rising fast. My thoughts turned to the lost canoe, and to reproaching myself with stupidity and not allowing enough rope, or looking at it more carefully. Suddenly I became all attention again. An entirely different sound now arrested me. It was distinctly a low groan, and followed almost immediately by heavy blows which fell on a soft substance, and then more groans, and again those sickening blows. There must be men here. Where are they, and what is it? I sat up and strained my eyes toward where the sound came from. The sounds had ceased again. Should I call out and let the man know that I was there? What puzzled me was the absolute darkness. How could anyone see the hidden object or do anything else in this dense obscurity? It appalled me. Anything might pass at an inch's distance. I could not tell what it was. How could anything human find its way about any more than I could? Perhaps there was a solid bulkhead dividing the forecastle from me, but it would have been very sound, no chink whatever, to prevent a gleam of ray of light finding its way out somewhere. I could not help feeling convinced that the whole hulk was open from one end to the other. Was I really dreaming after all? To convince myself that I was awake, I felt in my pockets for my notebook, and pulling out my pencil, I opened the book, holding it in my left hand, wrote as well as I could by feeling alone. I'm wide awake. It is about midnight, Christmas Eve, 1870, whatever. I found I had got to the bottom of the page, so I shut the book up. Resolving to look at it the next morning, I felt curious to see what the writing looked like by daylight, but all further speculation was cut short by the shuffling and dragging noise beginning again. There was no doubt but the sounds were louder and were coming my way. I never felt in all my life so uncomfortable. I may as well at once confess it, so frightened. There in that empty hole, over the boardless floor, over these rotting joists, somebody or something was dragging some heavy weight. What I could not imagine, only the shrieks, the blows, the groans, the dull thumping sounds compelled me to suspect the worst, to feel convinced that I was actually within some few feet of a horrible murder that had been committed, or being committed. I could form no idea of who the victim was, or who was the assassin. That I actually heard the sounds, I had no doubt. They were growing louder and more distinct. I felt painfully aware of this. The horror of the situation was intense. If only I could strike a light and see what was passing so close, but I had no matches. I could hear a sound as if someone was breathing stertorously, then a dull groan. And once more the cruel sudden blows fell again, followed by a drip, drip, and heavy drop of the dank water below, from which the sickening smell rose, pungent, reeking, horrible. The dragging, shuffling noise now began again. It came quite close to me, so close that I had only to put up my hand to touch it. The thing, good heavens, was it coming to my bunk? The thing passed all the time, dull drip of some heavy drops fell to the water. It was awful. All this time I was sitting up, holding my gun by its barrel, ready to use it if I were attacked. As the sound passed me in the closest, I could put the gun involuntarily but touched nothing. I shuddered at the thought that there was no floor over which the weight could be drawn. I must be dreaming some terribly vivid dream. It could not be real. I pinched myself. I felt as I was pinching myself, it was no dream. The sweat poured off my brow. My teeth chattered with the cold. It was terrific in its dreadful mystery. And now the sounds altered. The noises had reached the companion ladder. Something was climbing them with difficulty. The old stairs creaked, bump, thump. The thing was dragging up the steps with many pauses, and at last it seemed to have reached the deck. A long pause now followed. The silence grew dense around. I dreaded the stillness, the silence that made itself be heard almost more than the sounds. What new horror would that awful quiet bring forth? What terror was still brooding in the depths of that clinging darkness that could be felt? The absolute silence was broken, horribly broken, by a dull drip from the stairs, and then the dragging began again. Distant with less distinct, but the steps were louder. They came nearer over my head. The old boards creaked, and the weight was dragged right over me. I could hear it above my head, for the steps stopped. Two distinct raps, followed by a third, heavier one, sounded so clearly above me that it seemed almost as if it was something striking the rotten woodwork of the berth above my head. The sounds were horribly suggestive of the elbows of the head and body being dropped on the deck. And now, as if the horrors had not been enough, a fresh ghastliness was added. So close were the raps above me that I involuntarily moved as if I'd been struck by what caused them. As I did so, I felt something drop onto my head and slowly trickle over my forehead. It was too horrible. I sprang up in my disgust and with a wild cry stepped forward and instantly fell between the joists into the rank water below. The shock was acute. Had I been asleep and dreaming before, this must inevitably have roused me up. I found myself completely immersed in water, and for a moment was absolutely incapable of thinking. As it was pitch dark and my head had gone under, I could not tell whether I was above water or not, as I felt the bottom and struggled and splashed onto my legs. It was only by degrees I knew I must be standing with my head out the foul mixture, because I was able to breathe easily, although the wet running down from my hair dribbled into my mouth, and I stood shivering and gasping. It was astonishing how physical discomfort overcame a mental terror. Nothing can be more miserable than my present position, and my efforts were at once directed to getting out of this dreadful place. But let alone anyone who has ever had the ill luck to fall out of bed in his boyhood try to recollect his sensations. The bewildering realization that he is not in bed, that he does not know where he is, which way to go, or what to do to get back again. Everything he touches seems strange, and one piece of furniture much the same as the other. I well remember such. I was relieved to find I could easily reach the joist above me. I was always fairly good at gymnastics, and I had not much difficulty in drawing myself up and sitting on the joist, although the weight of my wet clothes added to my exertions considerably. Having so far succeeded, I sat and drained, as it were, into the water below. The smell was abominable. I never disliked myself so much, and I shivered with cold. As I could not get any wetter, I determined to go on deck somehow. But where was the companion ladder? I had nothing to guide me. Strange to say, the reality of my struggles had almost made me forget that the mysterious phenomena I had been listening to. But now I looked around. My attention was caught by the luminous patch which quivered flickering on my right. At what distance from me I could not tell. It was like the light from a glowworm, only larger and changing in shape. Sometimes elongated like a lambent oval, and then it would sway one way or the other as if caught in a draught of air. While I was looking at it and wondering what could cause it, I heard the steps over my head. They passed above me and seemed to grow louder on my left. A creeping dread again came over me. If only I could get out of this horrible place. But where were the stairs? I listened. The footfall seemed to be coming from the steps. Then the companion ladder must be on my left. But if I moved that way, I should meet the thing, whatever it was, that was coming down. I shuddered at the thought. However, I made up my mind. Stretching out my hand carefully, I felt for the next joist, reached it, and crawled across. I stopped to listen. The steps were coming nearer. My hearing had now become acute. I could almost tell the exact place of each footfall. It came closer, closer, quite close, surely, on the very joist of which I was sitting. I thought I could feel the joist quiver, and involuntarily moved my hand to prevent the heavy tread falling on it. The steps passed on, grew fainter, and ceased, and they drew near the pale, lambent light. One thing I noticed with curious horror, and that was that although the thing must have passed between me and the light, yet it was never for a moment obscured, which it must have been had anybody or substance passed between, and yet I was certain the steps went directly to me. It was all horribly mysterious, and what had become of the other sound, the thing that being dragged? An irresistible shudder passed over me, but I determined to pursue my way until I came to something. I would never do to sit and shiver there. After many narrow escapes of falling again, I reached a bulkhead, and cautiously feeling along it, I came to an opening. It was the companion ladder. By this time my feeling over the joist had become dry again. I felt along the step to be quite sure it was the stairs, and in doing so I touched something wet, sticky, and clammy. Oh horror, what was it? A cold shiver shook me nearly off the joist, and I felt an unutterable sense of repulsion to go on. However, the fresher air which came down the companion revived me, conquering my dread. I clambered onto the step, and it didn't take long to get upstairs and stand on the deck again. I think I never in all my life experienced such a sense of joy as I did on being out of that disgusting hole. It was true I was soaking wet, and the night wind cut through me like a knife, but these were things I could understand and were a matter of common experience. What I had gone through might only be a question of nerves and had no tangible or visible terror, but it was nonetheless very dreadful, and I would not go through such an experience again for the worlds. As I stood cowering under the lee of the bulwark, I looked around at the sky. There was a pale light as if daybreak away in the east, and it all seemed as if my troubles would be over with the dawn. It was bitterly cold. The wind had gone round to the north, and I could faintly make out the low shore astern. While I stood shivering there, a cry came down the wind. At first I thought it was a seabird, but then it sounded again. I felt sure it was a human voice. I sprang up to the taffrail and shouted on the top of my lungs, then paused. The cry came down clear and distinct. It was Jones's voice. Had he heard me? I waved my draggled pocket handkerchief and shouted again. In the silence which followed, I caught the words, "We're coming." What joyful words! Never did shipwrecked mariner on a lonely isle feel greater delight. My misery would soon be over. Anyhow, I should not have to wait long. Unfortunately, the tide was low and still falling. Nothing but a boat could reach me, I thought, and to get a boat would take some time. I therefore stamped up and down the deck to get warm, but I had an indistinguishable aversion for the companion ladder and the deep shadows of the forepart of the vessel. As I turned round in my walk, I thought I saw something moving over the mud. I stopped. It was undoubtedly a figure coming towards me. A voice hailed me in a gruff accent. "Lily, ahoy! Be anyone on board?" Was anyone on board? What an absurd question, and here I'd been shouting myself hoarse. However, I quickly reassured him, then understood what my rescuer did not sink in the soft mud. He had mud pantants on. Coming up as close as he could, he shouted to me to keep clear, and then threw first one then the other clattering woodboard on the deck. I found them, and under instructions of my friend, I did not take long in putting them on. The man was giving me directions as to how to manage, but I did not care how much wetter I got, and dropped over the side into the slime. Sliding and straddling, I managed to get up to my friend, and then together we skated, as it were, to the shore. Although skating very little represents the awkward splashes and slips I made on my way to the land. I found quite a little crowd awaiting me on the bank, but Jones was, with ready consideration, hurried me off to a cart he had in a lane near and drove me home. I told him the chief points of the adventure on our way, but did not say anything of the curious noises. It's odd how shy a man feels at telling what he knows people will never believe. It was not until the evening of the next day that I began to tell him, and then only after I was fortified by an excellent dinner and some very good claret. Jones listened attentively. He was far too kindly and well-bred to laugh at me, but I could see that he did not believe one word of the reality of the occurrence. "Very strange, how remarkable, quite extraordinary," he kept saying, with evident interest. But I was sure he put it all down to my fatigue and disordered imagination. And so, to do him justice, has everybody else to whom I've ever told the tale since. The fact is, we cannot, in this prosaic age, believe in anything least approaching the supernatural. Nor do I, but nevertheless I am certain as I am at writing these words that the thing did really happen and will happen again. May happen every night for all I know, only I don't intend to try to put my belief to the test. I have a theory which of course will be laughed at, as I am not the least scientific. I cannot bolster it up in scientific arguments. It is this: as Mr. Edison has now discovered that by certain simple process, human sounds can be reproduced at any future date, so accidentally owing to the combination of many curious coincidences, it might happen that the agonized cries of some suffering being, or the sounds made at one time when all other emotions are as nothing compared to the supreme sensations of one committing some awful crime, could be impressed on the atmosphere or surface of an enclosed building, which could be reproduced by a current of air passing into that building under the same atmospheric conditions. This is the vague explanation I have given to myself. However, be the explanation what it may, the facts are as I have stated them. Let those laugh who did not experience them. To return to the end of the story, There were two things I pointed out to Jones as conclusive as I was not dreaming. One was my pocketbook. I showed it to him. The words were quite clear, only of course very straggling. This facsimile of the writing, but I cannot count for the date, being 1837. The other points in the horrible stains on the hands and the clothes. A foul-smelling dark chocolate stain was on my hair, hands, and clothes. John said, of course, this was from the rest of the moldering ironwork, some of which no doubt had trickled down owing to the heavy rain through the defective caulking of the deck. The fact is, there is nothing in that ingenious mind cannot explain. But the question is the explanation the right one? I could easily account for the phosphorescent light. The water was foul and stagnant, and it was no doubt caused by the same gases which produced the well-known will-o'-the-wisp. We visited the ship, and I recovered my gun. There were the same stains on the deck as there were on my clothes, and curiously enough, they went in nearly a straight line over the place where I lay, from the top of the companion to the starboard bulwark. We carefully examined the forepart of the ship. It was as completely gutted as the rest of her. Jones was glad to get on deck again, as the atmosphere was very unpleasant and I had no wish to stay. At my request, Jones made every inquiry he could about the old hulk. Not much was elicited. It bore an evil name, and no one would go on board who could help it. So far, it looked as if it were credited with being haunted. The owner, who had been captain of her, had died about 3 years before. His character did not seem amiable, but as he had left his money to the most influential farmer in the district, the country, people were willing to talk against him. I went with Jones to call on the farmer and asked him point blank if he had ever heard whether a murder had been committed on board the Lily. He stared at me, then laughed. Not as I know of, was all his answer, and never got nearer than that. I feel that this is all very unsatisfactory. I wish I could give some thrilling and sensational explanation. I am sorry I cannot. My imagination suggests many, as no doubt it will to each of my readers who possesses that faculty. But I have only written this to tell the actual facts, not to add to our superabundant fiction. If ever I come across any details bearing upon the subject, I will not fail to communicate them at once. The vessel I found was the Lily of Gull, owned by one Master Gad Erwalker and built in 1801. The fire was burning low as James Chesterton, their jovial host, turned to Charlie. In the flickering light of candles and embers, he looked more like Fezziwig than ever, and Charlie wondered if he might have fallen asleep during some Dickens production on cable. "The last tale of the evening falls to you, my young friend," said Chesterton with an expansive gesture. Charlie had declined several times that evening. Now the fire was burning low, they turned to him expectantly. Rebecca gave him an encouraging smile. The truth was, he hated talking in front of groups of strangers. Others seemed to find it so easy, but his heart would always hammer and his voice would falter. And the only tales he could recall were the synopsis of various Christmas specials he had seen as a child. That hardly seemed to be what was called for here. Charlie looked at their host, put out his empty hands. "Look, no stories here," and shook his head. "Sorry," he said. Their host smiled, but there was a hint of anger in it, of rudeness perceived and not entirely forgiven. "I have one," ventured Rebecca. "I can go for him." Chesterton raised his hand. "Not necessary, my dear. No one should be forced to sing for his supper," although Charlie thought that was exactly what the man believed. The big man surveyed a clock on the mantel. "It is late, my friends, and tomorrow we shall have the most splendid Christmas. I wish you all sweet slumber and pleasant dreams." In their room, he and Rebecca tried their cells again to no avail. "Tomorrow the costumes will be off, and we'll get word to your folks," Charlie promised her. No valet or chambermaid came to see to their undressing, which was fine by Charlie. He had quite enough of the 18th century. Rebecca seemed troubled, and he pulled her close as they wiggled under the covers. "You okay? I just wish—" "You're a good storyteller, Charlie. I wish you had told them something, anything. You know I'm no good at public speaking, Beck. Besides, Fezziwig didn't really care. Don't call him that, she said in a whisper, and I think he does care very much. Charlie put his arm around her and kissed her. I'll apologize properly tomorrow, and we'll send him a nice bottle of wine for his hospitality. She nodded, and he kissed her nose, then her mouth. I love you, Beck. I love you too, she said. She started to say something, but shut her mouth. What? Nothing. I love you very much, Charlie. He nodded, smiling, and they blew out the candles. The bed was luxurious and comfortable, even though the blizzard howled outside. Charlie felt Rebecca in his arms, soft and warm. Merry Christmas, he whispered, and fell asleep. Charlie woke shivering from the cold, his back and legs aching from being cramped. He straightened, his back protesting, and found himself on a moth-eaten couch, stained and falling apart. Clearly a nesting place for mice and other vermin. He looked around him at the great room, now gone to mildew and rot, the great fireplace broken and empty save for ashes and beer cans. The great chandelier was gone, and the moldy wallpaper hung in strips like leprous flesh. Beck! Rebecca! His voice echoed in the cavernous space, small and lonely. He looked for her, but there was no sign of her, the host or any of the guests from last night. He wondered if he'd been drugged, his mind spinning out wild scenarios of a waitress at their last diner stopped slipping him a drug while Rebecca was kidnapped. He was dressed in his regular clothes, although his shirt was on backwards. He stumbled out of the great room to find the large staircase lying in charred rubble. The second story burned long ago, and the absent roof making way for rot and pigeons over what looked like decades, centuries even. That was absurd. He had been hit there last night. They both had, and they ate fine food and danced and told stories. Well, he had listened to stories. The downstairs was deserted, stripped of furnishings and decor long ago. The fine tapestries and paintings replaced with obscene graffiti and holes punched or kicked in the walls. He went to the front and found it boarded up with plywood, but this had been worked by vandals until one needed only push on the side to gain access or egress. It was a beautiful winter day outside, the sun shining in a crisp blue sky with just a smattering of white clouds. He made his way back to the car and was not quite surprised to find it started right up. As he was searching for a cell, something in his pocket crinkled. He pulled out a sheet of fine linen paper that looked ancient. I'm sorry, that's all it said. But he knew Rebecca's handwriting well enough. He got out of the car with the note, and an errant breeze tugged at it. Charlie held on to it, but it disintegrated like ashes in his hand, blowing over the hedge like gray snowflakes. He heard gay music from the house, music from long ago, and peeked around the hedge. The house looked whole again, just for a moment, and he saw Rebecca standing at the window. She was wearing a different dress, one as fine as the night before. She mimed that she loved him, and the house seemed to shrink and fade until it was the ruin he had left earlier. He reeled at the loss of her, and could his mind wanting to deny it all, to shut down and seek solace in some fantasy? No. He had gotten himself into this predicament and felt Rebecca's goodbye was a hint that he might make things right. He wrote down the house's position on the GPS, which seemed to be functioning all right again. Charlie knew there would be difficult times ahead. He would have to deal with a lot of tough questions and being alone, but he would prevail, and he would come back every Christmas Eve for the rest of his life if necessary, and he would have a story ready.
Hi y'all, this is Tara of Tara and Our Spirits talking, and you're watching Jessie's True Paranormal Adventures channel. Why don't you come on up and give me some sugar?
All of the snow in this winterland used to look so pretty, now making me moody. In the much time.